Shalom Rotem.
Shalom Danit.
So today is a special episode because we will be talking in English. To all of our followers who's asking for an English episode, well, here's your chance. To all of our new listeners, we are an Israeli podcast talking about how cybersecurity really looks like from behind the scenes. And this week, we have a very special guest, a stunts instructor, Carlos Cajigas, who came all the way from Puerto Rico to Israel for the first ever stunts course here. And we will be asking him about his journey and ask him for tips and how his cybersecurity profession looks like. And we will definitely not forget to ask him the identical questions that we're asking all of our guests. So let's go.
Hi, Carlos.
Hello.
How are you?
I am doing real well, thank you.
We're so excited to have you here on our podcast.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here, actually.
Wow, and we're very excited to be talking in English.
So please introduce yourself.
Oh, sure. My name is Carlos. My last name is Cajigas. I am originally from San Juan, Puerto Rico. Actually, I'm a SANS instructor working on my 7th year now at SANS. I am a digital forensics and incident response practitioner working at my own company. I've been in the business for about 17 years doing the work. Actually, my first 10 out of those 17 years were as a computer forensics detective in the state of Florida at a police department called the West Palm Beach Police Department, where my job was actually protect those which matter most, the children. I'm proud to say that I worked a lot of really interesting investigations and put a lot of bad people in jail where they belong for hurting children. We actually also proud to say we saved some lives while I was there. But after 10 years of doing that, my service, I decided that I wanted to move on from there and go into the incident response world. So I was recruited to go work at IBM, where I did about another 5 or 6 years in conjunction with IBM and other big companies. But about 2 years ago, I decided to leave the corporate world and I decided to start working for myself. So now I run my own business. It's called Covert Bit Forensics, and I am the chief technical officer at that organization. And here I am, living the dream in Israel, hanging out with you.
Wow, that sounds amazing because we have a lot of similar lines between our careers and so on. And I have so many questions to ask you about that. But I really want to hear about your journey because I know that transferring from data forensics to IR, it's a change. It's a change of how you see things and your perspective and the timelines that you need to be in action and to find your findings. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
No, that's absolutely correct. It was an absolutely difficult transition. There is no easy way to say this. It was hard. Now, but the interesting thing about the transition is a lot of people think that it's very easy to do. It isn't. The digital forensics incident response world all falls under one big science, but the artifacts that you analyze in the end user forensics world versus the incident response world are actually very different. It's a completely different approach. For example, when I was a detective and I was doing end user investigations, you're mostly looking at one system, and it was pretty much the same every time. You have a search warrant, you go to a location where a crime has been committed, you have the ability to go inside that location, you grab one system, you interrogate that system, figure out if it contains probable cause to make an arrest, and if it does, then that person is, well, going to jail that evening. And then what I did was I did the examination of that system. Most of the time, it was basic on child exploitation investigations, homicide investigations, and many more horrible criminal investigations that you have to figure out how they happened on a system. But in most of those cases, you're really just looking at one system, trying to find indications of that criminal activity. And that's about it. So think about that. You're always looking pretty much the same, looking at one system, looking for indications of how you can prove that activity occurred. And then going from just simply looking at one system, moving into the incident response world, where looking at just one system is not something that is, you don't have the luxury of time to do. You have to get answers right away, traditionally that afternoon, and you have to be able to find what happened on not just one system, but 1,000 systems. So what I'm trying to say is, in order for you to be able to determine what happened on 1,000 systems versus one is a completely different approach. One of the ways that you can, quickly get answers into 1,000 systems is need to have the ability to interrogate those systems quickly. The world of the EDR solutions, the endpoint detection and response solutions, have really given us incident responders a force multiplier at being able to investigate these incidents. So you have to use EDR-like utilities to quickly get visibility into all those systems, find the indicators of compromise, and continue with the investigation. That's one of the quickest ways that I can differentiate or explain the difference between the two.
What kind of organizations needs the IR services? Are you being called to every incident, or are there some kind of type of incidents or type of organizations that usually need the high-level team?
Yeah. Organizations that require incident response services are going to be organizations that need to quickly recover from a breach. And whether they want to admit it or not, they need it. Now, organizations that have the ability to have an investigation being conducted are traditionally the ones that are going to take the time to call somebody to come in and help them. If they have some sort of insurance, that makes it some sort of insurance to pay for the breach, that makes it a little bit easier. But if they don't, then it's sometimes they decide not to investigate the cases. But unfortunately, if you don't have visibility into what happened at the organization before the breach, you really don't have the ability to remediate that incident. And a lot of organizations that don't wish to conduct the investigations, one of the things that they do is they just simply wipe the system, put it back into production without really patching the hole of how the attacker got in. And inevitably, they actually get, it turns into a second breach right away.
Wow.
Usually the attacker is still in the network, right?
Usually the attacker is going to leave some sort of way of getting back into the network, especially if they know that they have been seen and they're getting ready to possibly be evicted out of the network. One of the things that they like to do is they like to elevate their game. In other words, is they start realizing that the client knows, and they maybe have already collected the data, and they start considering the possibility of actually deploying the destructive malware, whether it's just malware to cause damage to the organization or whether it's actually malware to encrypt the systems. That's actually some of the things that the attackers will do once they know that you know.
So basically, do you have any way to clear the organization in scale? The organization have like 1,000 servers. He cannot know what server still contain malware. So this is a major issue.
Absolutely, it's a major issue, and that's actually where having intelligence comes in. And I'm not talking about being smart. I'm talking about threat intelligence. Threat intelligence is the knowledge of what the attackers are doing, and the only way to get that intelligence is by actually conducting an investigation. One of the things that we actually talk about in the SANS Forensics 508 class, which is one of the classes that I teach for SANS, is we first need to start querying these systems. Querying is a way of saying interrogating these systems. Once you find one indicator of compromise, one of the things that we immediately do is we build an IOC for that indicator of compromise, usually using
IOC?
Yeah, an IOC, an indicator of compromise, usually using any kind of language that has the ability for you to create and consume an IOC. And then we start searching for all of the, let's say, 1,000 servers. Out of these 1,000 servers, tell me which systems have this IOC. And let's say you find 2 systems that have it. Those systems immediately get interrogated and investigated. And from there, you find another 1 or 2 IOCs. You build rules to be able to identify those IOCs, and then you go out and run search for those IOCs, and that allows you to find 2 more systems. And you continuously do that over and over and over and over again until you slow down at finding indicators of compromise. When you start slowing down finding indicators of compromise, that is about the time that you start getting the feeling that you understand, you have threat intelligence, that you have an idea as to what possibly is happening in the network. And it is then, and should only be then, that you then concentrate on actually coming up with a method for remediation.
As a student in your 4508 course, I have to say that your perspective on things and how you see the IR challenge and the investigations and the incidents, they taught me some new methodology. And even though I know the bits and bytes because I'm working in this science, so I know it, but the perspective is very important, and I want to thank you for sharing your experience with us, and it's great.
It's an absolute pleasure to hear something like that. It is music to my ears. That's one of the reasons why I teach. One of the reasons why I do what I do, and to be able to hear somebody as talented as you tell me something like that it reminds me of the reason why we still do what we do. No matter how much experience we have, no matter how many times we do this over and over and over again, I think that we are still going to be committed to being students of this science for the rest of our lives. And every time a new technique comes out, we like to study it, investigate it, and learn it. And as much as I have actually learned as much as you did this week by actually being able to have the opportunity to come out here to do this. I absolutely loved it. So thank you.
How many people you actually know in class that have a license for Axiom?
There were very few. Axiom is a fantastic utility that gives you the ability to interrogate and forensicate a system. A beautiful utility created by an old friend of mine, Jad Saliba, over at Magnet Forensics. So shout out to the friends at Magnet. It's not that many people. There should be more.
Do you have any more tools that you can suggest to people to use?
Oh my goodness.
Oh my God. What have you done? But
folks, for anybody out there that is unfamiliar with this fantastic utility called Velociraptor, I would recommend that you become familiar with it. It's going to be an EDR-like, SIM-like, free, open source utility that allows you to interrogate thousands of systems at a time. This is going to be this utility created by Mike Cohen, who is one of the folks over at responsible for creating the Google Rapid Response utility. This utility, Mike was over at Google. He's no longer there. He's now at Velocidex working on this utility. This utility is a game changer because it fixes and it solves a lot of the problems that other EDR-like utilities have. For example, not EDR-like, but let's say you want to connect to a system. We're here and we need to connect to a system in California, and that system is outside of the network. How would you go about doing that with the traditional software, right? You initiate a connection from here to that system in California, and that system in California is sitting at Starbucks. How are you going to get past the router at Starbucks to be able to make that connection to the system? Velociraptor solves that problem because the connection is made from the client back to the server. And if the server is publicly accessible, say for example, a server in the Amazon cloud, once that client, which is your workstation, has started and makes the connection to your server, it's a one-to-one, always established connection. So in a situation like this one right now, this solves problems. Let me tell you why. Number one, it's free, so anybody can utilize it. Number two, everybody from one day to the other went home, right? And everybody's working from home. We still need to be able to get visibility into our workstations. This utility can give you that visibility. It allows you to query the system. You can query for anything. You can query for processes. You can query for services. You can look at your event logs. If you need to collect data, you can collect anything from the system because I have a fantastic utility created by Eric Zimmerman, a fellow Forensics 508 instructor called CAPE, uses targets to collect data from the systems. All the CAPE targets are built into Velociraptor, so you can use it for collection as well. And the best part is that it's utilizing a language that is very easy to learn learn, so you can add extensibility and usability to it by knowing how to write artifacts in the language of Velociraptor called VQL. So, if you're not familiar with that utility, you should become familiar with it.
And it's free, right?
100% free. free.
So how do you compare this tool against, for example, traps of Palo Alto?
Yeah, that's a great question. I struggle with how to answer that because I love Velociraptor, but Velociraptor doesn't have the hundreds of thousands of people behind it, right? Let's say, for example, if I was talking to a friend of mine just last week, and I was telling him of the fantastic features of Velociraptor, and he said, well, we have Microsoft Advanced Threat Protection at the organization. And then we started comparing what they could do. I am a firm believer that you can do just about anything with Velociraptor. Your imagination is the only limitation. And
then target.
In the endpoint, correction, in the endpoint, yeah. And then we started looking at Microsoft ATP, and you know, I to be honest with you, it's pretty promising. It does a really good job. And one of the things that I learned is that, let's say, because they have the backing of hundreds of thousands of systems, millions of systems within the world, if a threat appears in a location in California today at 2 o'clock, that intelligence immediately gets provided back to Microsoft. They can actually build indicators of compromise that can be found across the world just a couple of minutes later. And that back-end intelligence that organizations like, you know, Palo Alto and Microsoft have is currently not available for a utility like Velociraptor. But even though it doesn't have that back-end intelligence completely available, it actually still allows you to do things that these other EDR utilities don't have. So I guess a nice combination of the two would be the best place in the world. If you have the money to buy these EDR utilities, have them. If you don't, you still can use Velociraptor to start querying your systems today.
Do you have any other tools?
When it comes to processing data, right? As an independent consultant, my number one important goal in order to help a client is to immediately start getting visibility into the network. Velociraptor provides that. All right, once you have visibility into the network and you want to start collecting data from the endpoints, Velociraptor can do that. Once you collect data, then you need to post-process that data so you can consume it, so you can make heads or tails of that data. One of my favorite utilities, which is also free to allow you to post-process artifacts, and I challenge anybody hearing to become familiar with it, would be Log2Timeline, another fantastic utility for just to be able to automatically post-process artifacts and create a timeline of events.
What is the name again?
Log2Timeline. Log2Timeline. It's a utility created by a gentleman called Kristen Gudjonsson, also from the Google IR team. So as far as other utilities that can then post-process data, there are so many out there. I'm a big fan of open source utilities. So outside of immediately getting visibility and querying the network, outside of data collection with Velociraptor, and outside of, you know, post-processing of every system with Log2Timeline, then the other utility that I would recommend people to become familiar with would be Yara. Yara is going to be, in my opinion, one of the better ways that you can actually have the ability to find intelligence. The moment that you develop a little bit of intelligence, you find something, you know of something, let's say a persistent mechanism in the current version run key. You find that evil, you find that indicator of compromise. And the next question is, how are you going to be able to then quickly search for that evil across all of your systems? You want to search for a specific string in the registry? Yara can do that for you. You want to search for a specific string in memory? Yara can do that for you. You want to search for a variation of a piece of malware that you have found? Yara can do that for you. So I think that those three utilities, for anybody who is interested in elevating their game, spending time learning those utilities, would be an absolute, would be an absolute must.
So basically, all those tools are related to Windows or Linux. So what about network tools or other embedded equipment in in the company?
Well, if you're going to have to get visibility into the network, then that's going to be a different story, right? I'm doing the analysis of compromised systems. If the company for me to be able to take a look at a PCAP, for example, they've collected some network information that they want to analyze, then one of my utilities to go would be T-Shark, which is a command line utility from Wireshark, because it quickly allows me to find what it is that I'm looking for. I would like to spend my time learning about that utility. But outside of that, another recommendation that I also talk about, if you really want to elevate your game in forensics or incident response, is teach yourself a scripting utility. If you don't know any of them, pick one of these two, Python or PowerShell. Teach yourself one of these scripting utilities. And one of the things that I mentioned is, do a couple of those things that I've mentioned and teach yourself a scripting utility. And before you know it, you're going to have the ability to command a better position because of the knowledge that you've given yourself. And knowledge usually translates into a better position. The more knowledge you have, the better position you can command, without a doubt, and a better salary too.
Do you see any differences now with the cloud, that everyone is using virtual machines or using the cloud? Do you see any transition in the profession of IR or data forensics?
Data in the cloud, no. I mean, yes, of course, there is definitely a transition, but the utilities that we have to give us visibility into these systems work equally the same on a physical system than they do in the cloud. So as long as you have the visibility that you need, as long as you have the ability to query these systems, or as long as you have something monitoring this system, the collection in the cloud can be accomplished with something like Velociraptor, or I would definitely recommend Velociraptor for acquisition if you have to acquire some data. So no, if the system is in the cloud, yeah, it becomes a little bit more challenging. Getting a full forensic image of the systems in the cloud has become a little bit harder, but the days of actually doing full forensic acquisitions are getting, slimmer and slimmer each day. But, if you have a system administrator that can have access to the underlying hard drive or physical disk of that virtual machine, and a full forensic image needs to be acquired, there are ways to still do that. So yes, there is a challenge, but there are solutions that can still give you the visibility into those cloud systems. Interesting.
Can you tell us about an interesting incident that you investigated?
So I think that there's a couple of stories that I can tell you. I'll start with one from many, many years ago while I was in the law enforcement world, which a lot of people really like to hear about that. And then we'll move into the incident response world. So let me tell you the story of James Kerwick. I think that's going to be interesting. I can drop a name because it's public, and nobody will ever look into it anymore. But let's call him James. James, unfortunately, was an adult who liked, let's say, the younger audience, the illegal type, unfortunately. But one of the things, and the only reason why this is interesting, is because James actually thought that he was being smart by storing his illegal data on a thumb drive. All right. So James had his own computer. There was actually no illegal data on the internal system. Everything was stored externally. So James thought that by having no data on the internal system and just everything stored externally, that as long as nobody ever found the external disk, that he would be okay. But unfortunately, one of his friends one day saw the illegal stuff and called the police. We responded. When we responded to the system and the house with a search warrant, James wasn't available. All right. So, but we collected the system, and I, as the examiner, I got the investigation of that system. My job was to figure out which user looked at that data. Now, in the criminal world, in order for somebody to be charged with possession of illegal data, notice that I said the word possession. You have to possess it, right? So if it's not in the system, how do you prove that possession? So it became a little bit harder. So here's where the interesting part comes in. We had to figure out a way to prove that the data was somewhere and that it had been viewed by that specific user. And one of the ways that we did that was actually by being able to look into an artifact that gave us evidence of the fact that data was accessed. And that artifact at that time were link files. Link files are actually a shell item that is stored inside of the recent directory of the user that viewed the data. So because it is tied to a user account, you can analyze the link files and you can tell when that data was viewed. Interestingly enough, let's say that the thumb drive was mounted as logical letter M. A lot of the link files were pointing back to files on logical letter M. And when I talk about files, I'm talking about files with names indicative of illegal activity. All right, so those files are always being pointed back to the M drive. The M drive turned out to be the thumb drive that was still attached to the computer when we acquired it. So,
because I'm always thinking, how could they prove what was on the thumb drive? Where did they find it? Where can he hit it? My God. Okay.
Yeah. So we looked at those link files. We were able to prove the fact that they were viewed at a specific time. They were viewed from the thumb drive. The thumb drive was not encrypted, so we were able to make that case. Interestingly enough, at that time, one of the techniques that I used to always enjoy doing was I would make a forensic image of the disk, and I used a piece of software called Xmount to actually convert the forensic image into a VMDK. That is a virtual disk that allows you to virtualize the forensic image and actually boot the image into forensic software. Well, when we did that and we booted the system and we looked at the user profile, the picture of the James profile was a picture of him. So, and it was password protected too. It was really difficult for him to say that was not his system. Resume for that individual was in there. We could see the times that the files were opened. And a lot of the data on the system was indicative of the fact that it pointed back to him. I actually sent my investigation to the lawyers talked to the suspect and offered a plea bargain. That is the ability to either take a case or take it to court. James decided to say, I'm not going to fight against these forensic examiners. I'm going to go ahead and take a plea. And a plea agreement was taken. And that was actually, believe it or not, one of my first cases in the law enforcement career. And for that reason, for the difficulty, which at that time was challenging to be able to actually utilize link files and data in removable media and be able to look at the history of the activity to be able to say that this data was viewed by this specific user. For that reason, I thought that was interesting.
Wow, very interesting. And another story from the IR world?
Yeah, another story. So another story from the IR world would be actually, let me see if I can tell you. I have another interesting one. One that was very similar to that specific case. I actually, while I was at one of my previous companies, I responded to Pennsylvania in order to investigate an incident where the CEO of the organization knew he was about to be fired, and we started investigating what activity the CEO had done while there. And one of the things that the CEO did was he went to a computer store, bought an external hard drive, and then using credentials from the organization, decided to go around different systems within the organization and actually steal data from the different employees within the organization. Because the CEO knew that the time was up, the CEO was going to be replaced, and for whatever reason, the CEO wanted to collect information from different systems into, well, an external hard drive. But the CEO made one interesting mistake, very similar to the mistake that James did, is that they connected the hard drive to the computer, that specific computer. And then when the hard drive was connected to that computer, files were accessed from the removable media, again, leaving evidence of activity on the system. On that case, we were never able to recover the removable media. But link files and other artifacts, again, gave us proof of the files that were accessed by this individual. And we used that information and we gave it to the new CEO of the organization to prepare a case against the old employee for theft of intellectual property and other cases. And that turned out to work out really well in our favor. But the question that I want to ask you a question. There's actually a moral to the story. It's not a question. I want to say there's a moral to the story. And the moral to the story here is, Well, let me ask you a question, and I'll tell them more. Why do you think that the user actually, so the CEO of the company, prior to walking out the door with his hard drive, why do you think the user actually clicked on the documents that were stolen from the other computers?
I guess he wanted to check that he copied the right file.
That's exactly it, right? You have one shot. You have one shot to be able to actually leave the organization. You need to make sure that you have your data, right? So now that is actually the correct answer. The moral of the story is never, ever, ever open a document that you intend to steal.
That's a good one.
That's a good.
That's a good
It's a
one.
good suggestion, right?
Yeah, perfect. I'm gonna implement that. Thank you.
It's good advice all around.
So in our podcast, we have a corner that we ask questions to different people that we interview to receive different answers to the same questions. Okay, first question. What is the most difficult challenge we have in this profession?
I think the most difficult challenge in this profession at this very moment is quickly getting visibility. Everybody who is interested in working an incident needs to quickly get that visibility. The quicker you have it, the quicker you can solve the problem. Visibility is key.
He's right, What if you could recommend people who wants to be a CISO at an organization? What would you recommend them to study?
Well, the certifications that are out there are the CISSP. That would be a great certification. But I would recommend that you study the science. Be a student of every single possible technical thing that you can get your hands on, and be a forward-thinking manager. Don't just, follow the norm. Think outside the box and be forward-thinking and be there for your team.
Well, if you have a CISO that doesn't have a lot of budget, what is the minimum requirement that you need to do?
This budget thing is not a problem these days. Well, the only problem is if you don't have money, then you better have time. And if you have time, there are lots of different open source utilities that you could use to defend your organization. If you don't want to put the time, you better have the money. But if you don't have the money, you got to put the time. There's no way around it.
I like it. How can we bring more women to this profession?
I absolutely love that. We have to continue to we have to continue to be forward thinking. We have to continue to give opportunities for everybody out there who deserve it. And I think that we have to continue to share the word. More people need to give more presentations so you can continue inspiring people like you. You need to do more presentations so you can continue inspire the next round of women. But if there's anything that anybody feels that I could be of help with, just reach out. I'd love to hear more and see how that actually evolves. I'm very interested in exactly that.
Risk assessment or PT?
Risk assessment?
Choose one.
Risk assessment.
A good CISO is a technical one or a manager one?
A good CISO is a manager. It's a manager one. You got to know how to inspire people, and you got to know how to help people.
Well, this question is usually meant for Israel, but what do you see as the weakest link in the cybersecurity?
Well, the weakest link in the cybersecurity world, unfortunately, is still going to be the level of education that normal people have. You and I, we're not normal, we're power users. But if the normal individual is still going to continue falling for these phishing emails and still going to continue falling for these, easy ways of actually getting malware double-clicked on the systems, we're going to continue to have job security for the many, many more years to come.
Is it the most common attack? The double clicking of users?
I think that in 2021, phishing attacks still continue to be the way that attackers get in the environment. I think that in the late 2000s, early 2010s, attackers would come in through the back door. They would just punch right in through the back door. We got better at fixing that vulnerability. We now need to continue to get better at being able to educate our individuals so they stop clicking on these links. And we will see what happens in the next 10 years and how there's a new way of getting in.
So what is the next attack vector that we need to look for?
That I don't know. I can't say that I know that I don't know. All I know is that once it's found, I'm going to be available to investigate how it happened.
And that's great. We recommend. I want to tell you that every question we asked Carlos and each answer he had was different than what I had in mind. It's like your usual thinking is out of the box. And I think you can see why I loved so much your lectures, because you get the answers precisely, and I agree with you.
Well, again, I appreciate it. I have been in the business for enough years to see when the political way of doing things works and when it doesn't work. And when it doesn't work, you have to not go with it. You have to do what works no matter what, right? It's not always popular to do the right thing. But when it's not popular, you have to do the right thing. And sometimes doing the right thing is going against your bosses, sometimes going against principles. But if it's going to be what fixes the problem, if it's going to be what empowers your people, then at the end of the day, it's the right thing. That's it.
I'm going to use it against you.
Thank you, Carlos.
Carlos, thank you. It was a pleasure.
No, the pleasure is all mine. I really appreciate it. I had fun. I would do it again any day of the week. Thanks so much for having me.
Bye.
Bye.
See you, folks.